I was warning about the housing bubble in 2004, 5, 6.
Yeah, you actually
saying,
predicted the collapse, I saw.
yeah, and I mean, to my view, it was really obvious. It was just painful that I couldn't get other economists to take it seriously. They're all kind of, even people who knew me, they'd kind of humor me and go, "Yeah, Dean," but I was going, look at the numbers. This doesn't make sense.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/The Rational View. Together, we can make a better future.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I'm exploring the divergence between productivity and wages in Western economies since the 1970s. This was covered in some detail in one of my first podcasts, and it is a striking failure of society that has somewhat derailed post-war successes and I think has led to the current situation of inequity and unrest that we face in Western civilization. It puts us in the strange and unenviable position that further robotics and AI enhancements and advancements that increase productivity are going to make the vast majority of the world poorer and further behind. If you like what you're hearing, please press like on your podcast app, share it with your friends, come chat with me in my Facebook group, come look for me on YouTube. Videos are presented on YouTube maybe about a month behind the podcast. So if you want right up to date, keep listening to the podcast. Dean Baker is the co-founder and a senior economist at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. He's written numerous books and articles. His most recent book is Rigged: How Globalization and the Rules of the Modern Economy Were Structured to Make the Rich Richer. Welcome to The Rational View.
Thanks a lot for having me on.
So I've looked a little bit into your bio. You founded the Center for Economic and Policy Research way back in 1999. And it's been characterized as a left-leaning economic policy think tank on Wikipedia. What inspired you to form this organization?
Well, I'd been in D.C. working for another think tank, also you can call it left-leaning, the Economic Policy Institute. We're left of center, both of us. And I just felt there were a lot of aspects to public debates at the time that weren't being well articulated. And I felt we could do better. I co-founded with an old friend of mine from graduate school, Mark Weisbrot, and we had the view that we could just, do a better job on our own. So to this day, I'm friends with everyone at Economic Policy Institute. We cooperate on a lot of stuff, but we just felt, we wanted to get things out quickly, wanted to do it without, as much oversight, and we felt we could do a lot. And, frankly, I'm pretty proud of what we've been able to do. We did a lot. When we first got started, we were very active on Social Security at that time. The absolute conventional wisdom in Washington was that Social Security had to be cut. I had the Democratic political strategist. I'm saying Democrat because it's bipartisan. It wasn't just Republicans who wanted to cut it. It was Democrats. And I had Democratic political strategists yelling at me saying, you can't say that there's not a crisis. People won't take you seriously. And so we put out a book, Social Security, the Phony Crisis. And we said, no, it's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. And guess what? It's 25 years later and there weren't cuts. Hopefully it'll remain the case. I was warning about the housing bubble in 2004, 5, 6.
Yeah, you actually predicted the collapse, I saw.
Yeah, and I mean, to my view, it was really obvious. It was just painful that I couldn't get other economists to take it seriously. They're all kind of, even people who knew me, they'd kind of humor me and go, "Yeah, Dean," but I was going, look at the numbers. This doesn't make sense. And it didn't make sense. And, it turned out to be a very bad story. So anyhow, we've been involved in a lot of debates. And again, I appreciate the fact that we could move quickly, get our material out, not go through a lot of things. And I think we've had a pretty good impact for a place our size.
I really like Obama as a communicator and as a president, but his bailout of the banks in the aftermath of the 2008 collapse, I think could be characterized as the single largest sellout of American workers in history. I mean, this was a collapse caused by the rich yet workers' savings have been devalued through the printing of trillions of dollars, the quantitative easing that happened after this to bail out the bad bets made by the financial bigwigs. Now, I think you're on record as opposing this bailout. What do you think should have happened?
Well, I would have liked to let the market work. There was a lot of dishonesty there, and that more than anything just really annoyed me. So we had people saying we'd get a second Great Depression. I don't mean like some random person on the street. I mean like, the head of the Treasury Department was saying we'll get a second Great Depression. President Obama was saying, and it was just a lie. I mean, it was just a lie. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. It's not complicated. I mean, there could be political issues, which I well understand, but they didn't say that we're going to go fall into a depression and then we won't be able to pass the bills that will allow us to get out. It was like that was going to be what's happened. So I would have first and foremost said, let's, let the banks go under, let these people get what the market gave them. We have the FDIC to insure deposits, so most of us don't have more than 250,000 in an account. There would be disruptions. I don't mean to say, there wouldn't have been disruptions. Absolutely, there would have been. But I think it would have been worthwhile letting we have this incredibly bloated financial sector. Let's downsize it and then, get it started on a more efficient basis. So I think that would have been far and away the best way to go. And again, I don't want to minimize that, there would have been negatives to it. But I always say, if you have a policy that you think is going to do something and you don't think it's going to hurt anyone, you don't understand the policy. They just don't come like that. What you have to do is hope it doesn't hurt too many people, yet you could help out those who are being hurt and, try and get them through a bad time. And, in this case, with the unemployment rate have been somewhat higher for a period of time, maybe it'd been a point, 2 point higher, but, I think we could have gotten it down quickly. And I think we'd end up in a much, much better place with that.
Mainly, it would be the rich that would have hurt from this. It was all the financial bets that were made in the banks that were over leveraged, and all of the people that were, sucking off that teat. Do you think that Obama did not have, people were lying to him because, basically the president doesn't hear alternative voices, and like the media wasn't putting out alternatives. This was a horrible crisis, Why is it that the people that we're talking to, I don't think he was aligned, as a Democrat with bailing out the big banks. Why did he just make that decision, do you think?
There was a real effort to silence people who were saying that you didn't have to bail out the banks. And I saw this literally firsthand. This is before Obama actually took office. This was back in the fall of 2008. President Bush was still in the White House. And this was when they put out their proposal for TARP, the Trouble Asset Relief Program. And they originally sent that to Congress asking for $700 billion. And it was literally just 2 pages. I don't know if you've ever had occasion to read through legislation. Not that recommended, but if you ever do, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages, even for relatively minor bills. This was $700 billion. And it was 2 pages. And most of the 2 pages were just saying that you can't sue us if you don't like what we did. Literally, I'm not kidding you. So, they sent this to Congress and they said, you got to approve it, got to do it right away or the whole economy is going to collapse. And there were skeptics caucuses that were formed by both the Republicans and Democrats. And I talked to the Democratic side with 2 other economists. And they were asking us, do we have to do this? And I was sort of struck because there were probably 45 people there, and they were members. I often talk to congressional staffers. Usually that's who you'd rather talk to because it's the staffers that, really know the issue. I'm not particularly knocking the reps, but they have, like 20 different things they have to cover. So
Sure.
You want to talk to that person who does banking. That's who you want to talk to, and they'll talk to the rep and let them know what the deal is. So anyhow, there were probably 45 members there. We talked to them for probably over 2 hours. So they were really listening. And, we're saying, look, you don't have to do this. Now, at the same time that we were meeting with them, the whole Democratic caucus was meeting. Nancy Pelosi, of course, was the speaker at the time. And, the other leadership, they were having a meeting. And they were having Larry Summers there, who, subsequently became the head of the National Economic Council under Obama. He'd been the Treasury Secretary under Clinton. So very big name economist, of course, president of Harvard previously, very big name. They had Gene Sperling, who was the head of the National Economic Council under Clinton, and I forget, he had another top position under Obama, so, very top people. They did not want us to speak to the larger caucus. So here we had 45 members. That's not an exact count, but a ballpark number. I'm not trying to exaggerate here. So a very large share of their caucus were sitting there talking with us for 2 we And they said, why don't you we have these three economists here. They have a different view. Why won't you let them speak to the whole caucus? And they argued with them for hours. And we were going to leave because we're sitting there all day. We got there, I don't know, noon or something. And we were there till, I think it was like 8:30 in the evening. They finally arranged for us to talk to the caucus. Now, most of the people had left that point, but they literally didn't want to, you go, fine, you disagree with us, but what's so dangerous about hearing our views? So there was like this full court press. If you don't agree with us, you're crazy. And, so it was like, it was not even on the table. So it was really just this full court press. And what actually did Obama hear? He probably heard Larry Summers. He didn't hear, any of anyone like myself. There weren't a lot of us, I'll grant that, but there were economists who were prepared to say, you don't have to do this. We could look to an alternative path, but we were really shut out of the conversation.
Wow. So the reason I came across you and invited you to this podcast is I've been following wages and productivity gap for some time. In one of my earlier podcasts, I was reviewing the data. Economist Robert Lawrence showed wages and productivity, after following in lockstep since about World War II, diverged between 1970 and 2012. Over this period, productivity grew by 124%, while wages didn't change significantly. Stansbury and Summers in 2017 provided a reanalysis of the problem. They noted that since 1975, productivity has increased 27% faster than median worker compensation and 47% faster than production and non-supervisory workers. Last summer, New York Times economic columnist Peter Coy wrote a piece denying that this wage and productivity gap exists, that that we're not taking the right measures. I'm not an economist, I'm a physicist. I wanted to understand whether or not I've made a mistake in highlighting this gap. Can you summarize Peter's case against a productivity wage gap?
Yeah, and it's funny because I've been in this debate a long time, starting from when I was at the Economic Policy Institute, because they were really front and center and calling attention to it. So there's a little hocus pocus here. So if we take average compensation, I'll come back to, I'm saying compensation for a reason, including benefits, healthcare, everything. Okay, If you take average compensation, average hourly compensation and productivity growth, they actually track pretty well up till about the last, well, we'll say this century. So from the 70s till 2000 or so, they track pretty closely. So let me just put this way, not enough of a difference anyone would say anything about it. There's always ups and downs, so they don't follow perfectly in line, but they follow pretty closely. If you look at median wages, or you'd mentioned production non-supervisory workers, so that pulls out management, pulls out higher paid, doctors, lawyers, professionals. It's about 80% of the workforce. Those have not tracked productivity. So what you have is a story where, if we go back to, we often economists refer to as the golden age, this period after World War II till the early 70s, 73, you had rapid economic growth, rapid productivity growth, rapid wage growth, all going together. Everything's going the right way. People at the bottom coming up, and again, I get in arguments, I go, well, things weren't great in the 50s. I'm not saying things were great in the 50s. I'm saying they were going in the right direction. So, right. If we look at the situation of black people in the 50s, no, it was really bad, but they were getting gains, so it was going in the right direction. So that's what we could say, maybe not fast enough. It was going in the right direction. That stops in the 70s. And 70s is a complicated decade. Basically, you get a lot of weird things, most obviously the oil shocks. I mean, there was more than that, but we had two huge OPEC price increases, really shook up the economy. So it's a bad economy story in the 70s, not so much inequality, but a bad economy. Then beginning in the 80s and 90s, you get this story where most workers are not sharing in wage growth, so in productivity growth. So if we take the overall average, we're including people on Wall Street, we're including people in Silicon Valley, we could say things look fine. But if we take a look at the typical worker, the median worker, half above, half below, we look at the average for the non-supervisory production workers, they're not doing fine. And that's to my view, the big problem. Now, since 2000, you have a little different story. Okay. There, it actually is a case where there's a divergence between productivity and average compensation. So what's going on there? There actually is some shift from wages to profits. So about 4 percentage points, which is a lot, so about 4 percentage points of income shifted from wages to profits. So that's not the story for this whole period. It's not most of the story of inequality, but that is an important part of it. And particularly, as I say, in the last, well, I guess it's 25 years now we've been in this century. That is much of the story.
Okay. But there's been this counter narrative that's emerged. I think Michael Strain from the American Enterprise Institute was publishing a paper titled "The Link Between Wages and Productivity is Strong," and he in this paper argues that, contrary to the current narrative in some policy circles, the link between productivity and wages is strong. He makes the argument that non-wage compensation has increased from the 70s to today from 14% to 19%. This explains something like 8.2% of the gap. He argues that using an output price index rather than the commonly used consumer inflation index explains 35% of the gap. Like 1/3 of this gap is because depends on which inflation index you use. And by including managers and professionals, we explain another third of this gap. I mean, that still leaves, a good chunk of gap. But
no, I'm aware of his criticisms. He and others have made that. I know Michael is a good guy, but the bottom line here is that we should make those adjustments. So he's right to make that. So I always do when I do productivity wage comparison. I use a common deflator, or not worth getting into details, but the point is you need a common deflator. So you could use the consumer price index deflator, which doesn't matter which one you use, but use the same one for both. That's fair. That's absolutely right. You look at non-wage compensation, that did rise, but that was mostly in the 80s. And interestingly, that was actually largely taxes. So the employer side of the Social Security payroll tax, and also Medicare. That was actually the biggest factor. There was some of it was healthcare, but most of it was actually that. But that stopped rising. So once you get to 2000, there's no notable increase in the non-wage share. But he's absolutely right. We have to adjust for that. But even with that, when you look at the period from 1980 to the present, you're down about 25, 30 percentage points. I'd have to check the latest numbers to give you a more exact number than that. So that's a big difference. So, just do the arithmetic on that, someone earning $25 an hour, if they had 25% more pay, they're at $32.50. That's, I think most of the people would think that's a big difference, so it's not, we can't wish this away. And, so they haven't got their share. And, to my view, that's a really big problem.
So what's at the basis is what changed? What's causing this? Where's the money going?
Well, in the 80s, it was going to high-end wages, and sort of a simple summary number that tells us that story. The Social Security tax has a cap, and it's currently, I think it's $175,000. Again, not an exact number, but ballpark. So on wages you earn above $175,000, you don't pay any Social Security taxes. So below that, you're paying, worker and employer each 6.2, so 12.4 together. But above that, you don't pay anything. Now, Social Security keeps good measures. They know, okay, what's the total wage bill? What goes over the top? So in the early 80s, 10% went over the top. By the 2000s, it was close to 20%. So you had a lot of money that had been going to ordinary workers, factory workers, retail clerks, people working in restaurants, whatever it might be. It's going to them. Instead, it's going to high-end workers. So these are CEOs, the Wall Street people are well situated in Silicon Valley. It's going to high-end workers. Now, part of that's a college, non-college, but really it was mostly the very high-end workers, because most workers aren't, about 7% of workers are at that cap. So it's, college workers, it's still only about 30%, maybe close to 40%, I should say, have college degree now, but still most of those are below that cap. So it's mostly very high-end workers, people with advanced degrees, or, obviously some college workers that get well situated. They end up as executives in major corporations or whatever. But it's a point being, it's a relatively small group of workers. It's not all college workers.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you've printed responses to these articles, published responses to these articles, highlighting some of the factors. You highlight that, as you mentioned before, that the financial sector has increased from 0.4% of GDP to 2.2% of GDP. And this is based mainly on preferential treatment. The financial sector gets preferential treatment. What are some of the advantages that the financial sector has that funnels money from production to finance?
Yeah, to be clear, I'm talking very narrow. I mean, I could talk about larger financial sector, and that's a big issue as well. But there, I'm just talking about the very, very narrow financial sector, the securities and commodities trading sector. So, basically people trading stocks, bonds, derivative instruments, options, whatever they might be.
Mhm.
And the point, I'll say there's a few things, but the most important one is simply they're not subject to any sort of sales tax. So, if I go and buy my sweatshirt here, I'm going to pay sales tax. Depending on the state, it's a different tax. Most of the things we buy is subject to sales tax. There's no tax of any, I shouldn't say no tax. There's a really, really small financial transactions tax on financial transactions. But, if you had a very modest tax, I'm not talking about the, 8% that I might pay in sales tax and, depending which state, but, let's say you had 1/10 of 1% tax on a sale of stock.
Mhm.
You would see a radical reduction in trading volume and a radical reduction in the money that's made by the people operating the industry. A lot of what goes on today wouldn't be profitable, even with a very, very small tax. I mean, 1/10 of 1%. And, I've talked about this for a long time, argued obviously with many economists that go, oh, but the markets would be less efficient because, all these trades, they wouldn't be profitable. Yeah, so what? I mean, it's, I'm sensitive, I'm an economist. I'm sensitive to, mispricing things. But you just go, wait, tell me how there's some great investment opportunity that if we had a 10th of 1% tax on, the stock trades, it wouldn't be undertaken. And, again, another way to emphasize this point is to go, the cost of trading has fallen enormously, just the electronic cost for obvious reasons, computers, So if we
Mhm.
go back, 40 years, 50 years, we'd be paying far more with no tax than we pay today with a 10th of 1% tax. So that I think, first and foremost. But, again, other things I was mentioning for the bailouts, that was banks, but you go back to the financial crisis, we bailed out everything. I mean, money market mutual funds, it was like everything. You're in trouble, we'll bail you out. And of course, there was the assurance that even where they didn't actually have a bailout, everyone understood you could invest with Goldman Sachs because if they get in trouble, we will bail them out. And that was true. That they could, that was understood, I had occasion to read Tim Geithner's book, who was Treasury Secretary under Obama, and of course, very much at the center of these bailouts. And he said, there'll be no more Lehmans. He says that in his book probably 20 times. That was, he wanted to make clear, we're not going to let a major financial institution collapse. So there was this implicit, which he tried to make it explicit, as explicit as possible. There's a guarantee from the government that it doesn't matter what they're doing, we're not going to let them collapse. So I see that as a very big subsidy.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I understand that the financial sector is important to a market economy in that it values markets, it values productivity, it puts prices on things. But is the productivity of the financial sector as useful as it makes itself out to be? I mean, do we need 2.2% of our economy? Is this a useful productivity thing? Or are they just printing money that devalues everyone else's work?
Well, I would just say it's a waste. It's, again, the way I think of the financial sector, I often make this analogy. It's an intermediate good. So, if we think of other things we consume, we go grocery store for food, we, need health care. We get, these are things that we value in and of themselves.
Mhm.
Financial financial sector, it's not like that. We need that to allocate capital. So you want it to go to businesses that are starting up, need to expand, whatever. Want to buy a house. We all understand that. We need that. We want to be as small as possible. And I make the analogy to the trucking industry. Suppose that the trucking industry had expanded fivefold relative to the size of the economy. I mean, we'd all be looking at like, what? What's going on there? And again, no one would say we don't
Yeah.
need the trucking industry. We need to get things to the
But
factories, get them
relative to the economy, that's huge. Are we
yeah.
getting this
So
much
so we'd be
service out
saying,
of
well,
the financial industry now that we weren't
yeah,
getting before?
yeah. So my point here is just that we have a lot of waste. We should look to have a much, much smaller financial industry, and we pay a price for, having, so much of our resources go to that. So we have all these people employed there who could be employed elsewhere. And a lot of the inequality, a lot of the big fortunes there, any number of billionaires who made their money in hedge funds, private equity funds. And, of course, they then make demands. They, want big houses, many houses. It's a drain on the economy.
Yeah, and I don't think this is the kind of waste that Elon Musk is going to go clean out, is he?
Somehow I don't think so. No, in fact, one of the I don't want to get the name wrong because I confuse my hedge fund people. But anyhow, when the Silicon Valley Bank blew up a couple of years back, I mean, it was just ungodly, foolish what they were doing. I don't follow them closely, so I had no idea. But you could say, well, anyone could see it after the fact. Well, yes, but you had all this long-term debt. Basically, they borrowed short-term, invested long-term, and the value of the long-term debt was going to plummet when interest rates rose. Anyone could have seen that. I mean, it's definitional. So it's not like you need some special insight. It's literally definitional. So if you just said to anyone, okay, what's going to happen to your assets if the interest rates go up, 1-2 percentage points, which they did. And again, it was predictable they would, because basically Powell was saying they're going to, the Fed says, I'm going to raise rates. You might believe it and take them seriously. So anyhow, it became insolvent, and they one of the hedge fund guys, again, I don't want to say the name because I don't want to malign the wrong person, but it is an Elon Musk buddy, and he ran, of course, to Biden. He said, "You got to bail us out. You got to bail us out," and they did.
Yeah, an interesting thing that you mentioned, you call free trade selective protectionism, that puts Western manufacturing workers in direct competition with workers from impoverished nations, whereas U.S. professional workers are getting 2 to 3 times as much as their counterparts in other wealthy countries. So, I think you're highlighting the fact that the policies are what creates this inequity, and it's not just a natural thing that is happening due to, say, robotics and automation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
No, that's exactly right. So if we go back, we had all these trade agreements. The first big one was probably, we have trade agreements going further back. My recent memory, maybe it's just my memory, but with the Canada-U.S. free trade agreement in the 80s, then we included Mexico and NAFTA, the North America free trade agreement that was signed into law under President Clinton. And that was about, we call them free trade agreements, but mostly what they're about is free trade of manufactured goods. And, I mentioned that we could have worked to have free trade in professional services. And I like to pick on doctors. I don't have anything particular against doctors, but they're extremely highly paid. The average pay of a doctor is over $360,000 a year. And if we compare that to, France, Germany, they're well paid there too, but it might be 150,000, 180,000. And we have close to 1 million doctors. So that's a lot of money. You can do the arithmetic on that. 1 million doctors getting paid 150,000 more than their counterparts elsewhere. That's 150 billion a year. That's real money, and again, so the issue here is we wanted to make it as easy as possible to get manufactured goods from Mexico and then subsequently China, get them to the United States with as few barriers, tariff or other barriers, because you have a lot of non-tariff barriers, get rid of all those, make it as easy as possible to get access to these goods. And they're cheap labor. Manufacturing workers get paid much, much less in those countries than the United States. That was true then, still true today. Okay, but why don't we do the same with doctors? Why don't we figure out, okay, why is it difficult for a doctor? And I fully appreciate quality issues. We want to make sure they're educated to our standards, that they're performing at our level. We could do that. So how do we make sure that, a doctor who's trained in Europe, in Canada, wherever it might be, they train to our level, and then they come practice in the United States just as if they'd gotten their degree in a U.S. medical school. And there was no interest in that. And it's not, if you want to have free trade, let's do it across the board. But there was literally no interest. You'd raise it with people and they kind of look at you blank face like, well, isn't that immigration? I go, I have cab drivers who are doctors, usually from developing countries. But, so they were here. They just weren't able to practice as doctors, So it wasn't an immigration question. It was a protectionist question. So
you highlight changes in patent law that have led to increasing inequity. What happened, and how does that impact inequity?
This is a huge issue. Again, hugely underappreciated. And here I'm saying not by some guy I grab on the street. I mean, among economists, they don't appreciate the changes in the law or how important they were. So we've made patents longer and stronger hugely so over the last 45 years or so. And a lot of that's been in trade agreements, but even domestically. One of the really big things domestically is in the United States, we had the Bayh-Dole bill that was passed in 1980 that made it possible, or I should say easier, it was still possible previously, but made it much easier to patent for private individuals or corporations to get patents on government-funded research. So here, probably the most important is research that was funded through the National Institutes of Health. And currently we spend like $50 billion a year. We'll see where that goes these days. But we had been spending like $50 billion a year on research. And basically that ended up being a subsidy to the pharmaceutical industry because they would have a lot of the research done on NIH's dollar. And then they would appropriate it. They'd carry it further. There are cases where you could point to where NIH basically took it through and they had a finished drug and, someone just picked it up and ran with it. But for the most part, it is more basic research. They'd have to do further work. But the point is they could get control of it and then end up making lots of money. And, it's very clear in the data. If you look at what was going on with spending on prescription drugs from 1960 to 1980 when Bayh-Dole was passed, there's very little change. It's about 0.4% of GDP. So there's little ups and downs, but basically it's very little change. Suddenly it takes off after Bayh-Dole passes. Now I'm going to say it was the only thing, but that was a very big thing. So it goes from 0.4% of GDP to currently it's about 2.2, 2.3. So the difference there, 1.8% of GDP, I can see about 540 billion a year. That's real money again. So that's a really, really big deal. Now it mattered for other things as well. You couldn't get a software patent until I think it was 92, until the early 90s. You could get copyrights on software. You couldn't get patents. So that was relatively new. You couldn't patent life forms. I'm forgetting the year when you were first allowed to patent life forms. So we extended patents in all sorts of different ways. We applied them in trade agreements. We made other countries adopt U.S. type patent law, which often they didn't have previously. We also made it longer. I mean, you could argue on this. Currently, it's 20 years from the day of application. Now, we used to have different patent lengths for different types of patents. Now, across the board, 20 years from the date of application. Copyrights, again, similar story. Copyrights is sort of funny because it was 45 years until the mid-70s. And then they extended it to, I'm forgetting the exact sequence here. I think it was to 60 years, then 75 years, and it's now 95 years. The active force there was Disney. And I'm not kidding you. Disney would go back to Congress and they were concerned Mickey Mouse was coming off copyright. And Mickey Mouse, remarkably, is still a big moneymaker for them. They have all this Mickey Mouse, you get Mickey Mouse shirt and cups and, so they didn't want to go off copyright protection. So they would extend the length of copyright retroactively, which again, to my mind, I understand why Disney wants it, but you go, the whole point of copyright is to give you incentive to do creative work, which we could argue the length, argue it's the best way. But the point is it's to give you incentive. I can't give someone incentive for what they did 90 years ago. So it was people dubbed it the Mickey Mouse Copyright Act, but that was so anyhow, you made these longer and stronger. I won't go into all the ways they made them stronger, but it was these were very conscious. This is very conscious policy. It's not just something we just threw all the pieces in the air and this is how it came down. Those people end up very rich. It was very conscious policy.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you argue that this is a real productivity decoupling from wages. Workers are being basically robbed by owners. Robots are taking over manufacturing jobs. Workers have to compete against robots and very poor countries to get their wages. They're basically not able to survive on what their manual labor is worth. What changes would you argue would be most effective in leveling this playing field? Are you, for example, a supporter of universal basic income as a potential way forward?
Well, I think the universal basic income is a good idea. I guess I would just see the political obstacles to that as being enormous. I mean, I was sort of struck going back to the debates in the Biden administration. He had an expanded child tax credit, which was only in place for 1 year. That was part of his initial recovery package they passed, just after coming into office. And he wanted to extend that, and he couldn't get that through. He needed, at that point, the Democrats still had a majority in both houses. He couldn't get that through. He had Joe Manchin in particular. I mean, not worth getting into the details here, but he would not budge on that, and you couldn't get any Republicans to sign on to it. And I just mentioned that because this is a very limited group. You're talking about children, and is particularly younger children, and there was just so much resistance to it. So the idea that we would be able to get to the point where we have any sort of meaningful universal basic income, I just think that's a huge, huge political obstacle. So, I mean, my view is we get most of our income through the market, for better or worse. Let's structure the market in ways that, improve the situation for, basically everyone. Well, maybe not those at the top, but, for, let's say, the bottom 80% of the population. So one of the things, we were talking about patents, copyrights a moment ago. Instead of making them longer and stronger, make them shorter and weaker. I've written about a lot of this, particularly in the case of prescription drugs, because, to my view, it's just kind of obscene. You have people that have a cancer or some other disease, and the drugs that will save their life or extend it or, allow them to live normally, whatever, those can cost tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. They don't actually cost tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. Now, research went into it, but at the point where you have the patient that needs the drug, what does it cost to manufacture the drug and deliver it to them? It's very rare that that's expensive. It might be 300, 500, 1,000. So, we have these stories. Oh, can this person, will their insurance cover it? Can people take out GoFundMes? I mean, this is utterly absurd. You already did the research. So my view is pay for the research up front. People still make plenty of money. I mean, I understand, I work for a living. I do research. I expect biomedical researchers. Many of them are great people and hardworking and very bright, fine, pay them good salaries, but don't put a patent on it. Just pay for it up front and let anyone produce it, and also let anyone build on it. Because again, another issue that, I think is very troublesome with the pharmaceutical industry is that so much of what they do is secret for obvious reasons. They don't want others to benefit from their research. So if you said, no, we're going to pay for the research up front, you're getting money to pay for the research, but everything you do goes online and anyone could use it. They could learn from it. If you have a breakthrough, they're going to build on it. If you have a failure, they'll learn from it and they won't do it. They won't make the same mistake. So I think that's a really important way to, both have better health care because, there are any number of, the opioid crisis is the most extreme case, but there are any number of cases where drug companies have pushed drugs that are not as effective as they claim they are, and sometimes not as safe as they claim they are. You destroy that incentive. It's not that everyone's always going to be so honest, but you just don't have that much incentive. You're selling a generic drug for $15 a prescription. You don't have the same incentive as if you're selling it for thousands and thousands of, so it just wouldn't pay to make a big effort to lie and cover up what you know to be true. So that would be a big start because that would be a lot of money that now is coming out of our pocket. I realize often it's paid by the government, it's often paid by insurers, but it does come out of our pocket one way or another. And that would be a big start in getting more money into workers' pockets. Now, I'd carry that further.
The counter argument to that is that obviously people aren't going to go spending money on research if they can't get the profits back. Will we have as much research if that's implemented?
Yeah, I would argue we would. I'll make a couple points here. First off, the argument they say now is they have to put up the money, and it could be 10 years, 15 years, even 20 years till they have a marketable drug. And that's absolutely right. So, they wouldn't do it if they didn't get it. Of course not. Of course not. I'm saying we're giving them the money up front. So you're not out the money. My preferred way, and I obviously argue about this, debate it, try and structure it differently. My preferred way is put up, say we're going to allocate, $5 billion a year for cancer research or maybe specific types, whatever. Figure out how to, and we'll sign long-term contracts. They're going to be the same companies. It could be Pfizer, it could be Merck. They'll compete for them. Here's what we know. Here's what we could do. Here's our track record. So we're going to get a 10-year or 12-year contract to do research in, let's say, lung cancer. And, everything we produce, everything we do, that's fully in the public domain. So they had a very substantial incentive to do good work because if they don't do it, they're not going to get another contract. So I think that would be, give them real incentive. The other point I'd make is, I understand we have the system, better or worse. We do get good drugs sometimes, I shouldn't say sometimes. We often get good drugs, sometimes bad drugs, but whatever. So you don't just throw out something that more or less works, throw it in the garbage and say, okay, we're stuck. But you could do it in certain areas. So you could say, okay, we're going to designate that we'll have, 5 billion a year for the next decade, 50 billion. The industry invests a little over 100 billion to give you a scale here. 5 billion a year will be designated for heart disease.
Mm-hmm.
And we could do that there. Pick another area, 2 or 3 areas. So we're not, and you're not going to arrest someone for doing their own research. They could still get their patents. The only issue would be is that they might be doing a drug for heart disease, and then you'll have this drug developed through the public funding system. It's going to be every bit as good and selling at generic prices. So they were hoping to sell their drug for 20, 30, 40,000 for a year's dosage. They're going to be competing with a drug that's every bit as good, selling for $200. So that's what I would look to do. So I think arguably, it would be every bit as good or better in terms of getting, being effective in developing new drugs. But also, again, we could do this in a way that's not a radical overhaul. We do it piecemeal.
Interesting. That does seem like a useful differentiator. Just going back to the arguments that were made against this this price gap, Michael Strain was highlighting different measures of inflation. The personal consumption expenditure price index, different from the consumer price index because it tracks changes in goods purchased due to price changes. He highlights this in his conclusions. I find it or near the conclusions, I find it kind of deceptive. Like, consumers would buy more steak if they could afford it, but because we can't only afford ground beef now, the PCE takes steak out of the inflation measure, and it doesn't look so bad because we've adjusted to lower quality goods out of necessity.
Yeah, I mean, there are arguments, and I've been in these for decades on, what the best price, measure of consumer inflation is. And it's really, I'll just put it this way. There is no perfect measure, and all of these things got more complicated. So I'll just give you an example, which I think is important. Most of us have cell phones, smartphones, in fact. Most of us have internet. Okay, well, that's an additional expense. So in other words, if I don't have internet, I'm kind of screwed in today's, economy society. You really, well, that's great. It's great to have it, but that's an additional expense. No, that expense never appeared in the consumer price index. And to try and be as concrete as possible, if I didn't have internet 3 decades ago, didn't matter. I mean, if you're an academic, it probably mattered. But for most people, you watch your TV, you could get cable. You didn't have internet, not a big deal. You didn't have an internet in 2025, you're screwed. So how do we measure that in the consumer price index? It doesn't appear there. Now, once you have it, the cost of it appears there. So the additional cost, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
So, we're spending, $80 a month on our internet service. If that goes up, that appears there. If it goes down, it appears there. But the fact that we have to spend $80 a month just to be in the same conversation with everyone else, that does not appear there. So, so what I've said about this is that we're not going to have a perfect index. And there are a lot of problems with that. And we could argue, and I'm familiar with not just Michael, I mean, many people have made argument of how the PCE is better. What I'll say is the PCE is lower. That's unambiguous. It will give us a lower measure of inflation. Whether that's better or not, as I say, there's not a perfect measure. If you want to show a lower measure, I'll get you the PCE. But I'm pretty comfortable using the CPI.
He further argues that market income and social insurance payments among households in the bottom 20% of the income distribution actually grew by 26% from 1979 to 2014, whereas the typical graph shows them stagnant. But he doesn't mention that over the same period, the fraction of dual income houses has nearly doubled, almost exactly accounting for this increase if you're just looking at number of incomes in a household.
I like to use the hourly wage. The median hourly wage is kind of the purest, make it compensation, to be fair, so depending how we're using it, take compensation. But that gets around the issue of 2-earner households because, I've had arguments with people, so you don't think women work? No, great, my wife's so, that's fine. I assume women are going to be working, but you should get some money for that. So you tell me that household income's gone up because you now have 2 workers rather than 1. That's not necessarily improvement in living standards. I mean, yes, it's gone up and a damn well better. And of course, there's obviously additional costs associated with the second worker in the household. If you have kids, you have to pay childcare. There's obviously transportation, commuting costs. So it's, as I say, I like taking the individual worker's wage as the starting point, just because it's the purest measure in my view.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we're kind of in the situation where, over the 70s to 2000, we had the introduction of robotics basically displacing manual labor workers. I think that was a big impact on the labor market. Now we have artificial intelligence coming online, and it's going to do the same thing to white collar jobs. How do we get it so that everyone can benefit from these advances rather than making it worse for the workers?
Well, I'm in general in favor of increasing productivity, and I think artificial intelligence is interesting that way because, exactly as you put it, that, robotics, insofar as we had increases in productivity, a lot of it was in manufacturing, displacing manufacturing workers. Artificial intelligence, I think, is going to displace a lot of higher end workers, a lot of lawyers, accountants, doctors. I mean, I've seen data showing that for diagnostics, artificial intelligence could do as good or better than an average doctor, and that's already. I mean, I assume take 5 years out, I imagine it'll get better. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a great thing. So hopefully that will reduce cost in a lot of areas. So in effect, that would mean we'll get cheaper healthcare, cheaper, less money spent on legal fees. I mean, that will percolate through the economy. So I'm mostly happy with that. I mean, I understand that, you have some people that are going to end up the short end of the stick. Hopefully, people would always talk about retraining manufacturing workers, and 99% of the time that was a joke, because they didn't have real jobs for them, so the retraining was kind of a joke. So I don't mean to be quite as cynical, but I'd like to think that if someone has a law degree and, it turns out there's not much demand for legal services, we could find some useful things for them to do with their skills. Because most of them, in fairness, they are skilled people, so there are things they could do. So they might not end up having a very good paying opportunity as a lawyer, but there hopefully will be other opportunities where they could use their skills, even if not the exact same skills.
See a lot more competition for politician jobs.
Exactly.
Okay, so this is very helpful. I think I've learned a lot about what the actual underlying concerns are in some of these things, but I don't see a lot of solutions, unfortunately. How hopeful are you about the future economically?
I guess I'm always a blind optimist. It's a little hard these last couple of weeks, but I think there's a lot of opportunities here that, I think that, I was harping on drugs just because I think that's so important and so clear. And, I think that's the sort of thing, if you can make headway. And we're starting to some extent with the Biden administration, excuse me, because they did start to do some work on lowering drug prices, and then they were looking, I know it's very cautious, but I think it's possible to get a foot in the door. You also have an international story where, we had this big breakthrough with China where they had DeepSeek, and it seems to be as good as, our best AI. It's much, much cheaper. So, I'm hoping that there'll be some breakthroughs because, again, a lot of these things, people, particularly people coming from the left, they often say, oh, we don't like the market. And my view is the opposite. I say, I want to structure the market to work the right way. Mm-hmm. And, the market has a lot of strength. I respect the market. It's a very useful tool. I always say it's like the wheel. You could do a lot of great things. You can do bad things with the wheel, but you could do a lot of good things. So I think the key is to find ways to move the market, to show, here's, taking the case of prescription drugs. Let's say we got the funding from NIH. It shouldn't be a crazy story. They're already spending a lot of money. So we're going to designate some of it to actually develop drugs, bring them through the testing process, and have them available as generics from day one. I think if you do that, people see that, they see this could be done. And again, I think you could apply the same sort of logic in many, many other areas. So I'm optimistic, but again, the last 2 weeks have been a bit of a shake-up to me.
Well, thank you for coming in and chatting with us. Really appreciate you taking the time. And if you'd like, I can send you a Rational View T-shirt for spending the time to chat.
I'd love that. So, that'd be great.
All right. Thanks so much.
Send me a link when you have this up.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.